interesting things about the concept of class and class politics is a number of times historically that right-wing political leaders and commentators want to tell us that the idea of class is an impediment to political progress. It's always about to be replaced by a national or a socio-economic shift that renders it redundant or irrelevant to that particular historical epoch. And in Ireland in 1918, a special party conference of the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party voted by 96 votes to 23 not to contest the 1918 election. The reason for that was to allow the election to become a kind of plebiscite on Ireland's constitutional status. Rather than, as the minority Labour movement had wanted, they wanted to use it as a launchpad for a movement to transform the country from a backward agrarian country dominated by bishops and landowners to a modern industrial society. Sinn Féin, though, argued that in 1918, Labour in Ireland must wait, and Labour in Ireland is still waiting. More recently, the political writer and commentator Peter Kellner, in 2010 it was, said half a century ago the typical Labour voter belonged to an utterly different tribe from the typical Tory voter. Now they occupy slightly different slots in the same continuum. Vast changes to the jobs we do and the lives we lead have swept old loyalties aside. In that sense, class is dead. So in the first example we looked at there in Ireland, class, or the notion of ending class society, is simply denied as the central purpose in politics in favour of the nation, the primacy of the nation. The second example, class difference is defined as social markers about how we consume and how we earn in order to consume, as opposed to the fundamental issue of power relationships. It is worth noting, by the way, even on the basis of social markers, that Owen Jones in his book Chavs argues that social distinctions still operate in a discriminatory way against working class forms of dress, speech and recreation. But to be clear, class and tensions between classes, what we normally describe in the left as class struggle, exists because it's still the case in all capitalist countries that those who carry out the actual process of creating goods and delivering services have limited or no control over the means to make those goods or create those services, including, for example, access to finance. In contrast, the wealthy, whether that's individuals or corporate entities, enjoy a vastly disproportionate share of the fruits of the labour of others. And you can see that in incomes. Because Roz is not letting me speak very long, I'll just make the point that, as you probably know, the top 10% on average have an income of around 80,000, whereas the top bottom is trying to be 8,500, so it's 10 times. And of course that disguises the real inequality, because the top 10% itself is a massive difference between the top 1%, who run about 1 million, and the rest of that privileged group. The average salary in Scotland, incidentally, is around £27,000, and that's important to know, because see, when you actually look at the other big issue in relation to class appropriation, which Caroline referred to, that size of income would not allow you to buy, as a private individual, health, education, housing and a social welfare system. And again, as Caroline mentioned, aided and abetted by the supranational European Union, the dominant class in Britain have actually gone about the business of shrinking the state through privatisation, outsourcing and attacks on welfare, otherwise known as the politics of austerity. And that, incidentally, and it's something we should pick up in discussion, has been supported not only by new Labour governments, but by Tory governments and by Scottish National Party governments alike, and it's something we need to discuss. So what do we do about it? Well, I think last Tuesday, again, as Caroline referred to, John McDonnell told us what we can do about it. We can support the programme that he's arguing for. He argued that austerity is not an economic necessity, it's a political choice. He promised a real living wage. He promised that Labour would force Starbucks and Vodafone and Amazon and Google to pay their fair share of taxes. He said there would be an end to the subsidies paid to companies that take money and then fail to provide jobs. He said there would be cuts to the £1 billion tax breaks given to buy-to-let landlords. And he said he'd raise money to implement a social system through fairer, more progressive taxation. Comrades, in 2015, Labour can't wait any more than it could wait in Ireland in 1918. Since the Corbyn revolution in Labour, we now have a party in the leadership that's capable of winning political power and taking on capital, but only a fool would think that that's anything but an enormous task. So it is over to us, as both Roz said in her introduction and Caroline in her contribution. So over to us, only we can win the hearts and minds, only we can combat the insidious lies of the right wing and the press that support them. And so I'd like to finish my brief input by the words that John MacDonald used at the end of his speech. We remain inspired by the belief and hope that another world is possible. This is our opportunity to prove it. Let's seize it.
Well done, that was under 6 minutes, so there you go.
Thanks, Caroline.
I'll now move on to Bill Butler.
Thanks very much, convener. I'll try to be as good as Vince, both in terms of content and in keeping to time. Can I thank John Foster for inviting me to say a few words and just discuss with comrades today the situation we find ourselves in as a labour and trade union movement, and obviously to the morning staff for organising this. As socialists, we always attempt to work towards a world of equality, a world which is democratic and diverse, whose inhabitants are well fed, well educated, and the aim is to live in a peaceful, sustainable world. That's the aim. But, let's be honest, for nearly 40 years we've been told that such a future is a fantasy and that the hopes of socialism's pioneers can never ever be realised. Politicians, and Vince is right about this, of all major parties, and let none of our English comrades mistake the SNP government. They are as much for the politics of austerity as anyone else. Politicians of all major parties have subscribed to the neoliberal view or worldview that the present unplanned economic system of largely unfettered markets is all that's on offer. All that's on offer. Now, many true believers see this as not unfortunate, but it's a good thing. We fundamentally disagree. But the challenges which we face, and Caroline talked about them, and others have talked about them, will talk about them, are not inconsiderable. They're huge. Mr Cameron's Tory government, his aim is no less than the destruction of the welfare state and the emasculation of the organised labour and trade union movement. People talk about, taking us back to 1926. People talk about taking us back to the age of Disraeli. But actually, aspects of this trade union, or anti-trade union act, take us back to Lord Liverpool and the Anti-Combination Acts. The only thing that isn't in this act, but we wait with bated breath for some of the backward Tory MPs to move it as an amendment, is transportation to Australia. It is as serious, or is almost as serious as that. Working people, those who have work, those who want work, those who've been workers, who are now retired, they are being put under increasingly intolerable pressure. 1 in 5 employees, around 4.9 million, are earning less than the living wage. The average weekly pay is now 11% lower in 2014 and in 2008, while average prices for goods and essential services have risen by 20% between 2009 and 2014. 320,000 mostly female workers in cleaning, retail, hospitality have been trapped in minimum wage jobs for 5 years or more. Up to 300,000 workers are paid below the statutory national minimum wage. Between 1.4 million and 2.7 million workers are on 0 hours contracts, and most awful of all is the statistic that our fellow citizens, our fellow workers, 913,000 people received food from a Trussell Trust food bank in 2013-2014, and that is completely unacceptable. Now, I am not saying this is not, you know, oh, everything's terrible. Yes, there are signs of hope. Yes, Commons election is good. We have an avowed socialist in charge of the main democratic socialist party in the UK, but there are still huge challenges ahead. You see, in the 1980s, the 1990s, the anti-trade union laws come in, and much to Mr Blair's shame, if he had any shame, the only thing they did was end the prohibition against trade unions organising at GCHQ. That's all they did. That's all we did. We need to reverse the anti-trade union laws. Restrictions on picketing are unfair. Restrictions on solidarity action are undemocratic. Balloting restrictions, the threat of sequestration, all of these need to be addressed and argued for within the Labour Party and the Labour and Trade Union movement, so that when Labour goes to the electorate in 2012, we say we will end the anti-trade union legislation of the 1980s and 1990s. No more, no less. You see, there has been, it's obvious, a weakening of the confidence of working class people, working class organisations. Carolyn talked about 1971. And then there was an attack and it was repelled. And there were days of hope and days of confidence. The Pentonville Five were released. Why? Because the organised labour and trade union movement said, no, we will not have, or we will not subscribe to these laws. But it needs working people working together to make things better. How do we restore that confidence? How do we persuade the majority that this meretricious consumer society is not all there is, and that there is a real alternative, that there is a better way? Well, I was about to quote Crick, but I wouldn't do that. He's good, but it's too long a quote for Roseanne. But let's take the Tories on. Let's say, as Glasgow City Council and other Labour-led local authorities have said in Scotland, that we will not comply with the trade union bill because it is not a trade union bill, it is an anti-trade union bill, it is unnecessary, it is vindictive, and it is ideological. And Labour authorities have said that they are going to do that, and I'm proud to be a Labour councillor in Glasgow City Council that's taken that stance. And I call here, at this autumn conference of the Morning Star, on SNP-led local authorities and indeed the SNP government to come out and say unequivocally, publicly, that they will not comply. They haven't done that yet. We live in hope. We live in hope, because there must be a wide combination of forces, progressive forces. And if they say that they are progressive, and some of them are, Chris Stevens, I think he's one of the progressives I can mention, can't mention too many more, we have got to ally with progressives in all parties, except the Tory party, of course, and none, because we actually have to win working class people back. We actually have to talk to people in communities. We actually have to stand shoulder to shoulder with people. I'm winding up, but you don't realise that. I am saying to you that we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with people in their everyday lives, whether it's organised workforces taking strike action and industrial action, whether it's community action in terms of defending jobs and services. We all have to act together, because only in that way do we have a chance to make sure that what we joined the Labour and Trade Union movement for, the establishment of socialism, can actually be achieved. I had a lot more to say, but I don't want to incur the wrath, Chair. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
It'd be time for you all as a panel to come back back in, because what I want to do is get the audience in for a bit of debate. So, moving on, Lynn Henderson.
I thought that meant that Vicky and I had 40 minutes to...
No, sorry.
When you strip out everything everybody else has said, all that maybe is left is a controversy. There's a few things I do need to go back on. I was going to talk at some length about the class divide and about the Tory ruling elite. I think Carolyn covered that really, really eloquently, and there's no need for me to go back over that thing. But the one thing I will say about the Piggate disgusting coverage is what disgusted me most of all about that act and about the way that was covered is it showed to me the arrogance of the ruling class in this country, that they think they can do anything and get away with it. Who would have thought a Prime Minister would survive that? He appears to be carrying on business as usual, because that's the ruling class that are at the top of the Tory party, and that's kind of what we are up against. If a working class boy had done that, student, young person, they would be locked up in Barlinnie, they would be called a sex offender, they would be, they would be castigated by their community, and so on. I think that's a real example of the divide and the perpetuation of the privilege of these people that run our country. And I think, we need to reflect back on the role that New Labour had in being part of the ruling class, being part of the kind of metropolitan elite, if you like, in the certain part of London that I know is Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. I think that I was going to also talk at length about my particular hate figure in New Labour, and that's Liam Byrne, but I won't go there. You all know the stories about Liam Byrne, so that's all crossed out. I was going to talk about the trade union bill. I think the speakers have covered that really well. But as a Scottish Secretary of a trade union that has members in the Scottish Government that John Swinney is responsible for, I have been putting to him, and I will continue to put to him, we do not expect to see our facility time cut. We do not expect to see any of these impositions on the trade union bill done to our members by you as our employer. We will put that to him absolutely strongly and continue. We expect to see that in his pay policy. It's going to be published in November. We also expect to see a 5% pay increase rather than the 1% Tory pay cap, but we'll see what we get there. Public services and the welfare state, I think, are absolutely fundamental to the issues around the class divide. We've got the comprehensive pension review just around the corner, 25th of November. We expect in PCS to see mass-scale privatisation in parts of the civil service. We're speaking to our colleagues in BIS, which is the department that we can see where they're going to do that privatisation. We're expecting hundreds of thousands of more jobs cut, and that 4-year 1% pay cap enforced. Again, we are saying to the Scottish Government, you say you're anti-austerity, you cannot possibly enforce another 4 years of a 1% pay cap on our members, your staff, the workers of Scotland. You call yourself a fair work government, let's see the colour of that money. I think in relation to Jeremy Corbyn, well, my whole life I've been waiting for this moment. I was telling Vince, 31 years member of the Labour Party, 6 months lapsed, and this comes along. Couldn't you pick your time worse? But the reason that I let my Labour Party membership lapse, comrades, was all because of the election of Jim Murphy as leader. I couldn't stomach it anymore. I have rejoined, so I am back in the fold. John McDonnell was the chair of the PCS parliamentary group. I heard him on the radio last night when turning to the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer to talk about Dennis Healy's unfortunate death. I thought, you are still taking that in and what that actually means. The left must stand firm, we must support our leadership, but we must also be honest about the difficulties that we face here in Scotland. And I think there is still, to an extent, Jeremy and John don't quite get what has happened here. And we need to be honest about that as the left are supporting them, and not try and pretend that we're going to sweep away the SNP in a minute, and that somehow Labour is naturally in Scotland over the last few years sitting to the left of the SNP, because I don't believe it is. And it's not through the hard work of comrades around this room and comrades like Neil Finlay, Katie Clark, Elaine Smith and so on. It's not about that, it's about where the party has positioned itself in Scotland has been to the right of Labour. All Nicola Sturgeon had to do was to take one step to the left of where Scottish Labour was sitting and wins the anti-austerity vote. There are so many people who have joined the SNP, 2 members of my immediate family, one a former member of the Communist Party, one that's never been involved in politics before, have joined the SNP. There's something strange going on when people have put their faith into one party as a political establishment. Labour used to have that position in Scotland and was forgiven for sins like PFI and so on. I think the SNP are going to be re-elected next year in spite of the efforts of people in this room, and we need to be honest about that, because we can't have Jeremy Corbyn held up as a person that failed to get Labour re-elected into government in Scotland, because it's not his fault. We need to work with people in our movement who voted yes and no, not to say come home to Labour, because their home should be Labour as well, whether you're yes or no. I voted yes, my home is Labour. I think we need to not work with people to try and convince them to think otherwise about how they feel about the independence question. We can have the debate. I think lots of comrades in this room have made fantastic debates about the economic case, about the political case for no. I think that the mood of this country and the mood of the working class and the working class communities is that they are still yes. There's these kind of I'm still yes badges. They're still saying, I didn't leave Labour, Labour left me. And the way to get those people back is not to attack them for what they voted last year or how they still feel about how Scotland should be run, but to have the policies and the politics that says we are the left, we are the anti-austerity party. Not that the SNP are rubbish at this and that and the other thing, but where we stand is firmly on the left. We support trade unions, we are part of the movement, and we want to build on that. That's the only way we're going to win back the people of Scotland to a Labour agenda. And Corbyn can't do it alone. We have to work with him, and he needs to listen to that mood here in Scotland. I really, really like, the thing I particularly like about Jeremy Corbyn is the rejection of the personal abuse, and I don't think that's the kind of politics that we need to be doing. There's too much of that in Scottish politics. It's snide, it's personal, and it undermines our political agenda. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker of this morning's session, Vicky Grandon.
Yes, I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody this morning, not even necessarily myself, but I do have a gift for the chair, which is I'm going to put back about 3 of my 5 minutes into the pot, because I'm quite interested in hearing what people have to say, because I think so much has been covered. Caroline, I not only hope that I can wear a Kill the Bill t-shirt, I also am looking forward to We Killed the Bill t-shirt, and I'm sorry that anybody has suggested that isn't the correct phrase, because this is just yet another battle that we have to fight to win. The other comment I wanted to make was I still haven't a Scooby, as they say in Scotland, what class I am. I don't know what my grandparents who were refugees class was. I don't know what my parents who were refugees class was, so who knows. I do know that the latest stat I picked up was 2011 census said they were 17.3% of Glasgow's population. I hope they're not people like me, but I mean, they are a black and ethnic minority who were not born in the UK. I'm sure some of them do know what class they are, but some of them don't. So let's make sure that we get them involved in the politics of now, the politics that we're talking about, because it is too easy sometimes to fall into the habit of the way that we converse amongst ourselves and make people feel, where do I fit into that? Am I a worker when I'm in full-time paid employment with facilities time and registered contract? Am I a worker when I'm on 0 hours, sessional, temporary, casual, seasonal? Am I a worker when I'm doing 3 jobs just to try and make it work, and so on? Some of the points about food banks and so on, when John McDonnell was here a few years ago, and he told us they were starting the social cleansing of people who couldn't pay the bedroom tax in his area. They were moving them to Southampton and Manchester. Recently I visited one of my sons in Chatham-Kent. They dumped a whole number of people there. There is no employment for them. There is really no hope there for them. And what John McDonnell said at the same time was he had set up a food bank pick-up and distribution point and a drop-in centre at his offices, and I immediately rushed out of here and said, well, can't everybody do that? Can't every trade union office? Can't every MP, councillors where they have the facilities, MSP do it? Well, you know, I got so far and no further with that, because then I hit the red tape and I had to write motions, and then I had to get them passed through, and then somebody nitpicked about a comma, somebody nitpicked about a word, and well, we couldn't really have these people turning up to our door, heaven forfend, looking for something, and so on. And I'm also very glad when I see a headline saying that there's been this huge response to the refugee crisis. That could be deconstructed, and that Scotland's going to take 2,000. What about our homeless? Can we not talk about everybody who needs appropriate housing? Can we not talk about the new concept of citizens' income? Can we not talk about the way that local government is not going to be able to provide bare minimum services that we all utterly depend on? Where would we be if our rubbish wasn't uplifted, if our taps didn't pour water in the morning? So what a lot of challenges to add to Caroline's list, but I'm very keen to hear what everybody has to say. Thank you.
Wins the prize for having the smallest speaking notes I've ever seen. Okay, so the reason that I was rushing the speakers a bit is because I think it's important to get a bit of a plenary debate going and get people's thoughts on where we're at this morning. So I'm just going to open it up to the floor. Thoughts, contributions, questions to any of the panel members, all welcome, and then I'll bring all the panel back in at the end for a quick comment.